I'm continuing and concluding my discussion of Francesca and Dante in Canto V of the Divine Comedy of the Inferno. And I want to pick it right up with the line I mentioned in the last segment, "That day we read no further." Now, it may seem like this is just a very interesting and kind of telling and a wink wink and we know what's really going on here type of line, but it turns out that for Dante it's a lot more than that. The line is actually a direct reference to something that is said by Saint Augustine in his great work called The Confessions. Now, again, this is a little bit of why with Dante it helps to have notes, because while it's possible for an extremely astute reader to read this line and go, oh, you know what? This evokes a faint memory. Didn't Augustine in the Confessions say something kind of like this? But most people aren't going to think like that. But Dante does. Dante is very aware of the biblical tradition. He's very familiar with Augustine. This is actually one of the most learned men in Europe. Now, let's turn to Augustine's Confessions for a moment. Augustine was himself a dissident, a Manichaean, a heretic, somebody who was very reluctant to sort of join this tribe of Christians whom he thought to be a little intellectually shallow, and he didn't think that their views made any sense. And so the Confessions chronicles Augustine's long journey. But over time, Augustine is able to overcome his objections. He begins to see the truth of Christianity, but he can't sort of take the final step of sort of going for it and deciding, you know what? I'm going to become a Christian. Later, of course, he becomes a bishop, the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa. And of course, he's perhaps one of the handful of most influential figures in Christianity and Christendom. But toward the end of the Confessions, Augustine has a famous scene where he's in a garden. And he's walking around and he's wrestling with it, with his thoughts about should I take the final step or shouldn't I? And he's got his little, he has a book in his hand and he opens the book and he's reading now from Paul. Now, pause for a moment right here to notice that Augustine is reading from Paul and Francesca is sitting next to a guy named Paulo. Paulo is actually Paul. Very different Pauls, of course. And when Augustine is reading from Paul, he reads a line which basically is to the effect of, it's time to take a decision. It's time to move on this. There is a time to kind of, there's a time to sort of resolve and go for it. And Augustine then writes, that day I read no further. So in other words, that day I made my decision, and Augustine goes on, nor was there need, meaning I didn't need to read any further. Then my mind was settled. So think of it. Here's Augustine using this exact same line, that day I read no further, in order to make a decision for God, which will ultimately result in Augustine being, of course, in heaven. And here, what Dante is doing is using that exact same line to the inverse effect. So here is Francesca, that day we read no further, meaning I made my decision. I exercised my will, exactly the same as Augustine, but in the opposite direction. And of course, in bursts her husband in the middle of things, kills Paolo, kills Francesca. That's why the two of them are right here in hell. Now, what's really remarkable, and we'll close kind of with this, is the way that Dante reacts to this. Here's Dante. And he says that when he heard this, he goes, in such a way that pity blurred my senses. I swooned as though to die and fell to hell's floor as a body, dead, falls. So Dante basically collapses. Before he collapses, his eyes fill with tears. He can't really see straight. So think of how he is moved by what he hears. And he moved with what? Not moved with scorn, not moved with, think of the tremendous wreckage that you caused to really 3 lives, your life, Paolo's life, your husband's life, as a result of all this. No, Dante is like, what What a moving story. What a, and interestingly, critics over the centuries, it's very revealing. You tell a lot of yourself by how you read this poem. The poem kind of exposes you. And if the critic goes, oh, Paolo and Francesca, love conquers all. They defeated hell. Even in hell, they're together. They're happy. No, they're not happy. Just read the canto. They're miserable. They don't speak. Francesca won't use Paolo's name. He's writhing in pain. And even Francesca says to Dante a little earlier, she says this, Dante says, tell me more. And Francesca says, there is no greater pain than to remember in our present grief past happiness. So Francesca's saying, I don't really want to tell you because, the temptation was thrilling at the moment, but it's painful for me to tell you now because look at me, look at where we are, and look at what it did to us, and look at how it ended my life. So I don't want to say. But she still says. And I think what the meaning of this for Dante is this, that we think of sin as something that is like harmful to other people. This is very much the liberal idea that something is bad, when it hurts somebody else. But otherwise, it's just you. You can do whatever you want, but just make sure it doesn't hurt someone else. But Dante's point here, and we'll see this throughout the Inferno, is that sin has its primary bad effect on the sinner. The sinner actually suffers the most. Other people suffer too. And Dante is very aware of the social consequences of sin and how it affects the church and how it affects society. But he's making here the very profound point that the sin hurts you. I remember many years ago when I was reading Plato's Republic for the first time and then Plato's other works, one of them called the Gorgias, Socrates makes an amazing argument where he basically says in one line, it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. It's better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. It's better, in other words, for someone else to do wrong to you than to you to do wrong to them. And I've thought about this single line for 30 years. What could Socrates possibly mean by this? But here we get Dante clarifying this exact same point. And I think what Dante is getting at is that when you suffer wrong, it's an external harm to you, but it's a harm only to your body. It's a harm to your finances, or it's a harm to your convenience, or you're hurt in some external way. But if you do wrong, you're actually corrupting yourself. You're actually damaging your own soul. And that's going to have a far more lasting impact than anything that somebody else can do to you. What they're doing to you is from the outside. What you're doing is from the inside. And we see here with Francesca. So Dante swoons, he's on Francesca's side. But let's remember, this is only Canto V. There are 33 cantos and 34 in the Inferno, and 33 more in the Paradiso, 33 more in the Purgatorio. So Dante has a lot to learn. And one of the lessons that he's going to have to learn throughout hell, there was a sign on the gates of hell. I mentioned part of it, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. But part of it was also, this is a place of justice. And what that means is that the people who are in hell, they belong in hell. And who put them in hell is God. And because God is just, God's decisions are always right. And so we have this kind of interesting tussle. Dante is going through the Inferno. He's meeting these sinners. They're always giving him their side of the story. And Dante is like, yeah, you're right. And the lesson that Dante has to learn as he goes through the Inferno is, no, you're not right. God's right. We need to be on God's side in all this.